The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his tactical gear one final time. The Navy SEAL team had been inserted into the remote valley 3 hours before dawn, their mission clear but dangerous: locate and neutralize a high-value Taliban commander who had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces. Rodriguez looked around at his 5-man team. Each operator was a veteran of multiple deployments, their faces painted with camouflage paint that couldn't hide the determination in their eyes. Petty Officer First Class Jake Thompson checked his rifle scope for the 3rd time, while Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Chen secured the medical supplies that could mean the difference between life and death in these unforgiving mountains. The intelligence briefing had been thorough but concerning. The target, known by the code name Viper, had established a compound in a valley surrounded by steep ridges. Local informants reported that he rarely stayed in one place for more than 24 hours, making this operation a narrow window of opportunity. What worried Rodriguez most was the terrain. The valley was like a natural amphitheater, with multiple high points that could provide enemy fighters with commanding views of anyone approaching. Chief Petty Officer Williams, the team leader, raised his hand and pointed toward a narrow goat path that wound down into the valley. The plan was straightforward: approach the compound during daylight hours when the enemy would least expect an assault, neutralize the target, gather intelligence, and extract to the landing zone 3 kilometers away. Simple in concept, but Rodriguez had learned that simple plans often became complicated very quickly in Afghanistan. The team moved with practiced silence down the rocky slope. Each step was calculated, each movement deliberate. The weight of their equipment, rifles, ammunition, communications gear, and medical supplies would have exhausted ordinary soldiers, but these men had trained for years to operate in exactly these conditions. The thin mountain air made every breath precious, but their conditioning allowed them to maintain a steady pace toward their objective. As they descended, Rodriguez noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The compound below was quiet, too quiet. In his experience, Taliban strongholds usually showed some signs of activity during daylight hours. Guards would be visible, there would be movement between buildings, and they would typically see cooking fires or other signs of habitation. This compound looked almost abandoned, which could mean one of 2 things. Either their intelligence was wrong and the target had already moved, or they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. Thompson, who was serving as the team's designated marksman, raised his binoculars and studied the compound through his scope. The buildings were traditional Afghan construction: thick mud walls that could stop small arms fire, flat roofs perfect for defensive positions, and narrow windows that could conceal enemy fighters. What concerned him most was the complete absence of any human activity. Even abandoned compounds usually showed some evidence of recent occupation. The team reached a position approximately 400 meters from the compound and took cover behind a cluster of large rocks. Williams pulled out his satellite communications device and attempted to contact their command post, but the mountains were interfering with the signal. They were effectively on their own until they could reach higher ground or complete their mission and move to the extraction point. Rodriguez studied the surrounding ridges through his rifle scope, looking for any sign of enemy movement. The morning light was now fully illuminating the valley, and he could see every detail of the landscape around them. The ridges rose steeply on 3 sides, creating natural choke points that any defending force could use to devastating effect. If the Taliban knew they were coming, this would be the perfect place to spring an ambush. Chen, the team medic, was also scanning the area, but his trained eye was looking for different details. He noted the positions of cover and concealment, the likely routes they would need to use if someone was wounded, and the distance to their extraction point. In his medical pack, he carried enough supplies to keep his teammates alive long enough to reach proper medical care, but he knew that in this remote location, prevention was far better than treatment. The team spent 20 minutes observing the compound, looking for any signs of life or activity. Williams finally made the decision to move closer. They would advance to within 100 meters of the target building, where they could get a better view and determine whether their target was actually present. The alternative was to abort the mission and return to base with no actionable intelligence, which was unacceptable given the importance of their target. Moving in single file, the SEALs began their final approach to the compound. Rodriguez felt the familiar pre-combat tension building in his muscles. His senses seemed heightened. Every sound, every movement in his peripheral vision, every change in the wind direction registered in his consciousness. This was the moment when months of training and preparation would either pay off or prove insufficient. The compound consisted of 3 buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main structure appeared to be a residence, while the 2 smaller buildings looked like they might be used for storage or as quarters for guards. The walls around the compound were approximately 8 feet high, with a single gate visible on the side facing their approach route. Everything about the layout suggested that whoever had chosen this location understood military tactics. As they moved closer, Thompson noticed something that made him freeze in place. On the roof of the main building, he could see what appeared to be a small pile of spent brass cartridges, evidence that someone had been firing from that position recently. He signaled to Williams, who immediately called for the team to take cover. They were no longer approaching an abandoned compound. They were moving toward a position that had been recently occupied and possibly still defended. Williams made a tactical decision that would save their lives. Instead of continuing the direct approach, he ordered the team to circle around to the far side of the compound, where they could observe from a different angle and potentially spot any defenders who might be waiting for them. This route would take them closer to the base of the eastern ridge, but it would also give them a better understanding of what they were facing. The movement to the new position took 15 minutes of careful navigation across loose rocks and steep terrain. When they finally reached their new observation point, the view of the compound was dramatically different. From this angle, they could see into the central courtyard, and what they observed made their situation suddenly much more dangerous. The courtyard contained evidence of recent activity: tire tracks from a vehicle, areas where the dirt had been recently disturbed, and what appeared to be defensive positions that had been hastily constructed. More concerning was the fact that they could now see into some of the building windows, and at least one room appeared to contain military equipment and supplies. Rodriguez was studying the ridgeline above them when he saw something that made his blood run cold. A brief reflection of sunlight off what could only be a rifle scope, positioned on the ridge approximately 300 meters above their location. Someone was watching them, and that someone was armed and in a position to fire down into their location with devastating effect. He immediately signaled to the rest of the team, but before anyone could react, the silence of the mountain morning was shattered by the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle firing from somewhere above them. The bullet struck the rock inches from Thompson's position, sending fragments of stone flying through the air. The trap they had feared was now a reality, and their training was about to be put to the ultimate test in a fight for survival against an enemy who had chosen the time, place, and terms of engagement. The first rifle shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and Rodriguez knew instantly that they were in serious trouble. The bullet had come from the eastern ridge, but before anyone could react, muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the valley. The SEALs had walked directly into a carefully planned ambush, with enemy fighters positioned on at least 3 sides of their location. "Contact! Multiple shooters!" Williams shouted into his radio as he dove behind a boulder. The distinctive sound of AK-47 rifles joined the sniper fire, creating a deadly crossfire that forced the team to seek whatever cover they could find among the scattered rocks. The Taliban fighters had clearly been waiting for them, and they had chosen their positions with deadly precision. Thompson immediately began returning fire toward the ridge where the sniper was located, his rifle scope allowing him to pick out the enemy position among the rocks. But as soon as he fired, bullets began striking the ground around his position, forcing him to move quickly to avoid being pinned down. The enemy had multiple shooters, and they were using coordinated fire to prevent the SEALs from establishing effective defensive positions. Rodriguez rolled behind a large rock and tried to assess their situation. The enemy fire was coming from at least 4 different positions: the sniper on the eastern ridge, 2 automatic weapons positions on the northern slope, and what sounded like several individual riflemen scattered around the valley rim. The Taliban had clearly studied this terrain and knew exactly how to use it to their advantage. Chen, the medic, was trapped in the open when the firing started. He sprinted toward the nearest cover, diving behind a pile of stones just as bullets began striking the ground where he had been standing. The weight of his medical pack made him slower than usual, but his training kicked in as he calculated the distances between cover positions and planned his next move. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the enclosed valley, with each shot echoing off the surrounding ridges and making it difficult to determine exactly where the enemy positions were located. Williams knew that they needed to break contact and move to more defensible terrain, but the enemy had positioned themselves to control all the logical escape routes from the valley floor. "We're encircled!" Rodriguez shouted to Williams, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. The team leader was already coming to the same conclusion as he studied the muzzle flashes erupting from positions all around their location. The Taliban had used their intelligence network to determine the likely approach route and had positioned fighters to create an inescapable killing zone. The sniper on the ridge was proving to be their most immediate threat. His elevated position gave him a clear view of most of the valley floor, and his accurate fire was preventing the SEALs from moving to better positions. Every time one of them tried to relocate, precise rifle fire would force them back into cover. Thompson was engaging the sniper with his own rifle, but the enemy fighter was well concealed and protected by rocks that provided excellent cover. Williams made a tactical decision that their survival might depend on. He ordered Chen to move toward the base of the western ridge, where a small depression in the ground might provide better protection from the enemy fire. This movement would be extremely dangerous, but staying in their current position meant certain death as the enemy fighters adjusted their aim and began to coordinate their fire more effectively. Chen understood the urgency of the situation. He checked his rifle, ensured his medical pack was secure, and prepared to make a sprint across 30 meters of open ground. The enemy bullets were striking closer to his position with each passing minute, and he knew that waiting would only make the situation worse. Thompson provided covering fire as Chen began his movement, sending rapid, accurate shots toward the enemy positions on the northern slope. The covering fire forced the Taliban fighters to keep their heads down, giving Chen the few seconds he needed to reach the depression at the base of the ridge. But as soon as he dove into the shallow cover, enemy fire began striking the ground around his new position. The western ridge that Chen had reached was steep and rocky, offering some protection from the enemy fighters on the other slopes. But it also presented a new problem. They could hear voices speaking in Pashto somewhere above them, indicating that additional enemy fighters were moving into position on the ridge directly overhead. The trap was tightening, and their options for escape were rapidly disappearing. Rodriguez had been studying the enemy firing patterns, trying to identify which positions posed the greatest threat. The sniper on the eastern ridge was accurate and patient, waiting for clear shots before firing. The automatic weapons positions on the northern slope were using suppressive fire to keep the SEALs pinned down, while the individual riflemen were trying to maneuver into better firing positions. Williams attempted to contact their command post again, but the radio was still unable to penetrate the surrounding mountains. Even if the signal had gotten through, he knew that close air support or extraction helicopters would take at least 30 minutes to reach their location. Time they probably didn't have. They were going to have to fight their way out of this situation using only their own weapons and training. The enemy fire was becoming more coordinated as the Taliban fighters adjusted to the SEALs' positions. Bullets were now striking within inches of their cover, and the constant pressure was preventing them from returning effective fire. Thompson had managed to wound one of the automatic weapons operators, but the position was quickly taken over by another fighter who continued the devastating suppressive fire. Chen realized that their current positions were untenable. The enemy had too much high ground advantage, and they were slowly being surrounded as additional fighters moved into position. He could hear the sound of rocks being disturbed on the ridge above him, indicating that someone was moving closer to his location. If enemy fighters reached the ridge crest directly overhead, they would be able to fire down into the depression where he was taking cover. The ammunition situation was also becoming critical. The team had carried a combat load appropriate for their original mission, but they had not anticipated a sustained firefight against a numerically superior enemy force. Thompson was already down to his last few magazines, and he knew that the others were facing the same problem. Rodriguez spotted movement on the southern rim of the valley. Additional enemy fighters were moving into position to close off what had been their planned escape route. The Taliban were methodically surrounding them, using their superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain to create an inescapable trap. The original mission to capture or eliminate their target had become a desperate fight for survival. The sound of the gunfire was attracting attention from across the valley. Williams could see dust clouds rising from several locations where vehicles were approaching the area, indicating that enemy reinforcements were moving toward their location. What had started as an ambush by a dozen fighters was rapidly developing into a battle against a much larger enemy force. Thompson made a critical observation that would change their tactical situation. The sniper on the eastern ridge was firing from a position that was partially concealed by a large boulder, but Thompson had been studying the location and believed he had identified a weakness in the enemy's position. If he could get to a position about 50 meters to his left, he might be able to get a clear shot at the sniper who was causing them so much trouble. The movement to this new firing position would be extremely dangerous. Thompson would have to cross open ground while under fire from multiple enemy positions, and there was no guarantee that he would be able to eliminate the sniper even if he reached the new location. But Williams recognized that their current situation was deteriorating rapidly, and bold action might be their only chance for survival. Chen had been listening to the sounds coming from the ridge above his position, and he was certain that enemy fighters were moving closer to his location. He could hear voices and the sound of equipment being moved, indicating that someone was preparing to engage his position from above. He signaled to Williams that they needed to move immediately, or risk being trapped in their current positions. The Taliban fighters were demonstrating tactical discipline and coordination that surprised the SEALs. Instead of simply firing wildly at their positions, the enemy was using measured, accurate fire to pin them down, while other fighters maneuvered into better positions. This level of tactical sophistication suggested that they were facing experienced fighters who had probably fought against coalition forces before. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different enemy positions, and he was certain there were additional fighters that he couldn't locate. The Taliban had clearly planned this ambush carefully, positioning their forces to create overlapping fields of fire that would prevent any escape from the valley floor. Every route out of their current location was covered by enemy weapons. The situation reached a critical point when Williams realized that they had been fighting for almost 20 minutes, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. Thompson was down to his last magazine, Chen had used most of his rifle ammunition, and Rodriguez was conserving his shots for only the clearest targets. They needed to break contact immediately or face the prospect of being overrun by superior numbers. Williams knew they had seconds to act before their position became completely untenable. The enemy fire was intensifying, and he could hear the distinct sound of additional fighters moving into position on multiple ridges around their location. The Taliban had clearly committed significant resources to this ambush, and they were determined to eliminate the SEAL team before any rescue could arrive. Thompson had been waiting for the right moment to make his move toward the position where he might be able to engage the sniper. When a brief lull in the enemy fire occurred, he signaled to Rodriguez and began his sprint across the rocky ground. Enemy bullets immediately began striking around his position, but his teammates provided covering fire that forced the Taliban fighters to keep their heads down during his movement. The new firing position gave Thompson a different angle on the eastern ridge, and for the first time since the ambush began, he had a partially clear view of where the sniper was located. Through his scope, he could see the barrel of the enemy rifle protruding from between two large rocks, and he could make out part of the shooter's body. It wasn't a perfect shot, but it was the best opportunity they were going to get. Rodriguez and Chen continued to engage the other enemy positions, while Thompson lined up his shot. The distance to the sniper position was approximately 350 meters, with a slight upward angle that required him to adjust his aim. The wind in the valley was minimal, but the stress of combat and the need to fire quickly while under enemy fire made this one of the most challenging shots of his military career. Thompson controlled his breathing and squeezed the trigger smoothly, just as he had done thousands of times during training. The bullet struck the sniper in the upper chest, and the enemy fighter immediately fell backward out of sight. The accurate fire from the eastern ridge ceased instantly, giving the SEAL team their first tactical advantage since the ambush began. With the sniper eliminated, Williams could see a possible escape route along the base of the eastern ridge. The route would take them away from the compound and toward higher ground where they might be able to establish radio contact with their command post. It was still dangerous, with enemy fighters positioned to fire on their movement, but it was their best chance for survival. Chen had been monitoring the sounds from the ridge above his position, and he was certain that enemy fighters were now very close to being able to fire down into his location. He could hear voices speaking urgently in Pashto, and the sound of equipment being positioned suggested that someone was preparing to engage his position with grenades or automatic weapons fire. Williams made the decision to move immediately. He signaled for Chen to prepare for movement while Thompson and Rodriguez provided covering fire. The plan was for Chen to move first, followed by Thompson, with Rodriguez and Williams providing rearguard action as they withdrew from their current positions. Chen emerged from his depression and began moving rapidly along the base of the ridge, using whatever cover was available among the scattered rocks and boulders. Enemy fire immediately focused on his movement, but Thompson and Rodriguez were sending accurate shots toward the Taliban positions, forcing the enemy fighters to take cover rather than maintaining continuous fire. The movement was successful, and Chen reached a position that provided better cover and concealment approximately 100 meters closer to their planned escape route. From this new position, he could provide covering fire for the next team member while also serving as an early warning system if additional enemy fighters approached from that direction. Thompson began his movement next, carrying his sniper rifle and the additional equipment that made him valuable for long-range engagements. The enemy fighters had adjusted to the team's new positions and were directing intense fire at anyone who attempted to move. Thompson had to bound from cover to cover, spending only seconds in each position before moving again to avoid the increasingly accurate enemy fire. Rodriguez was engaging multiple enemy positions simultaneously, trying to suppress enough of the Taliban fire to allow his teammates to move safely. His rifle was running low on ammunition, but he was making every shot count, forcing enemy fighters to keep their heads down during critical moments when his teammates were exposed during movement. Williams was coordinating the withdrawal while also engaging enemy targets when opportunities presented themselves. His radio was still unable to reach their command post, but he continued trying to establish contact as they moved toward higher ground. Even a brief radio transmission might be enough to call in air support or at least notify their headquarters of their situation. The Taliban fighters were not content to simply let the SEAL team withdraw. Enemy fighters on the northern slope were attempting to parallel their movement, trying to get ahead of the Americans and establish new ambush positions along their escape route. Williams could see movement on the ridges ahead of their planned route, indicating that the enemy was still trying to encircle and eliminate them. Thompson reached Chen's position and immediately began engaging the enemy fighters who were trying to maneuver ahead of their withdrawal route. His accurate rifle fire struck 2 Taliban fighters who had been moving carelessly across open ground, forcing the others to take cover and slowing their attempt to establish new ambush positions. Rodriguez began his movement toward the consolidated position, but as he emerged from cover, intense automatic weapons fire forced him to dive behind a boulder that provided only minimal protection. Enemy bullets were striking within inches of his position, and he was effectively pinned down while his teammates were too far away to provide effective covering fire. Williams realized that Rodriguez was in immediate danger of being overrun by enemy fighters who were moving closer to his position. The team leader made the decision to move back toward Rodriguez's location, even though this would put him at extreme risk and potentially compromise their withdrawal plan. Chen and Thompson maintained suppressive fire on the enemy positions, while Williams moved back toward Rodriguez. The Taliban fighters were now focusing most of their fire on Rodriguez's position, apparently recognizing that they had an opportunity to eliminate at least one member of the SEAL team. Williams reached Rodriguez's position just as enemy fighters appeared on the ridge directly above them. The Taliban fighters had grenades and were preparing to drop them down onto the American position when Williams engaged them with rapid, accurate rifle fire. 2 enemy fighters fell immediately, while the others were forced to take cover before they could employ their grenades. With Williams providing close support, Rodriguez was able to move from his exposed position to better cover nearby. The 2 SEALs then began moving together toward the position where Chen and Thompson were established, while maintaining defensive fire against the enemy fighters who continued to pursue them. The consolidated SEAL position was now located approximately 200 meters from where the ambush had begun, and they had successfully eliminated or suppressed several enemy positions. But the Taliban forces were regrouping and bringing additional fighters into the area, making their situation only temporarily improved. Thompson had been scanning the surrounding area through his rifle scope, looking for signs of additional enemy movement or potential escape routes. He spotted what appeared to be a narrow path that led up the eastern ridge toward higher ground, where they might be able to establish radio contact and call for support. Williams assessed their ammunition situation and realized they had perhaps 10 minutes of combat capability remaining before they would be forced to rely on their sidearms. The path that Thompson had identified was their best option for reaching a position where they could call for help, but it would require them to move through an area that was still partially covered by enemy fire. Chen took point for the movement up the ridge, using his knowledge of combat medicine to assess which routes would be safest if anyone was wounded during the climb. The path was steep and rocky, requiring the use of hands as well as feet in some sections, making it difficult to maintain security while climbing. The Taliban fighters were following their movement, but the steep terrain made it difficult for the enemy to maintain effective fire while also attempting to pursue the Americans. Several enemy fighters attempted to follow the same path but were forced to take cover when Thompson engaged them with accurate rifle fire from higher up the slope. Rodriguez was monitoring their rear security while also assisting with the climb when necessary. He could see enemy fighters gathering at the base of the ridge, apparently preparing for a coordinated assault to prevent the Americans from reaching the ridge crest. The race was now between the SEAL team's ability to reach defensible high ground and the enemy's ability to organize an effective pursuit. Williams finally achieved radio contact when they reached a position approximately halfway up the ridge. The signal was weak and intermittent, but he was able to transmit their location and request immediate air support. The response was that close air support was already en route and should arrive within 15 minutes. The knowledge that help was coming gave the team renewed energy for the final push to the ridge crest. Thompson and Chen had established a defensive position where they could provide covering fire for Rodriguez and Williams as they completed the climb. The enemy fire from below was becoming less accurate due to the increased distance and the difficult upward angle. When they finally reached the ridge crest, the SEAL team had a commanding view of the entire valley and could see the full extent of the Taliban force that had ambushed them. At least 20 enemy fighters were visible in various positions around the valley, with additional fighters still arriving in vehicles from other locations. The sound of approaching aircraft reached them before they could see the planes. 2 A-10 attack aircraft appeared from the south, flying low over the mountains, and immediately beginning their attack on the enemy positions that Williams had identified through radio communication. The effect was devastating and immediate, with enemy fighters abandoning their positions and fleeing toward any available cover. The air support continued for 20 minutes, systematically destroying the enemy positions and vehicles, while the SEAL team provided target identification and damage assessment. When the attack was complete, the valley below was silent, except for the sound of burning vehicles and scattered secondary explosions. Their extraction helicopter arrived an hour later, landing on a flat area near the ridge crest where the team had established a defensive perimeter. As they lifted off and flew away from the mountains, Rodriguez looked back at the valley where they had fought for their lives and survived against overwhelming odds through training, teamwork, and the kind of courage that defines the warriors who serve their country in the most dangerous places on earth.